Well, a lot's been happening over the last 2 weeks since you've been away. You've probably seen in Ukraine. Things seem to be moving at quite a pace there, and most of it's been internal. There are a few external factors which will come on to a minute. It looks as though President Zelensky has been moving his ministers round and sacking some and bringing in others. Caused quite a stir, actually. I suppose they're at war, but I can't imagine over here if one minister was sacked that people would be out on the streets and actively blocking roads and protesting about him being moved. But that's what originally happened on the 15th of July when this guy, Mikhailo Fedorov, who's a young fellow who was brought in as a military chief only 6 months ago, and he's credited with having run the drone campaign.
Yeah, I saw that.
Very, very, very successful for the Ukrainians, and in some places halted the Russian advance, and in other places it would appear has cut off their supply lines. I don't know whether you've seen, whether you watch Sky at all, but there's a Michael, what's his name
Michael
on
Clark.
Sky? Yeah, leaps around with his maps and what have you. He's been showing people how there's a main road that leads down through the Donbass towards Crimea, which is where most of the supplies for Crimea go, and these drones have been cutting that off. Similarly, they've made this bridge that Putin built between Crimea and the mainland.
Oh, that one, yeah.
Yeah, unusable because they've got things flying over the top all the time and you never know. So there's been a state of emergency enacted in Crimea because they haven't got any petrol left and they're having lights going off and all sorts of stuff happening. Anyway, this guy Fedorov is the master man behind all that, and he was working with as I say, he's 35, so he's a relatively young Turk, and he's in with all the modern technology. He was working under the commander-in-chief, this guy called Alexander Syrski, who's 60, so a guy who's a lot more established, been there for a lot longer, and was one of the architects of saving Kyiv being invaded on the first day of the Russian invasion. So they've all got a lot of skin in the game, but apparently it got to a point where they couldn't work together.
So they were both military people, and there's not a minister.
Absolutely. And Sir was the commander-in-chief, and this guy, Fedorov, was working under him ostensibly.
Right.
But they got to a point, as I say, nobody's released the exact details. They couldn't work together. And so initially Zelensky sacked this guy, Fedorov, the younger fellow, and left Syrski in place. All these protesters then have gone out onto the streets. It's incredible that he's got so much support. He's almost like a pop star, it would seem, because all these young people are on the streets supporting this guy, Fedorov. And the demands of the protesters was that he should be reinstated, that Syrski, the old guy, should be sacked, and they should move upon, carry on moving on that basis and leave the younger fellow in charge. Syrski has duly been sacked, and he's been replaced with somebody who they all seem to like, this 43-year-old, another young Turk, effectively, Major General Mikhailo Drapatyi, and he's taken over. Now, the big question is now as to whether they're going to reinstate Fedorov, because he's the guy that all the protesters seem to want back in play. All this is going on against the backdrop of what's actually taking place on the front line, clearly. You probably heard as well that the Ukrainian offensive, if we can call it that, against Russia, in respect to the drones that are going deep into Russia now. You remember when this all started, there was big concern about whether we could cross borders and we could only
long-range Storm Shadows and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that all seems to have gone. Well, they're producing their own weaponry now, so I suppose there's no control over that. But they're now attacking a company called Wildberries. Did you read about this?
Yeah, they're like an Amazon, aren't they?
They are like an Amazon, but what I found quite fascinating was that not only are they like an Amazon in one sense, but they're retail warehouses apparently for the military as well. So if you're running out of parts or what, you get online and order this stuff off of effectively what's their Amazon, and they deliver the parts to you in Donbass or what have you. Their attack. It's sad, obviously, in one sense that there are civilians working in these logistics hubs, and some of them are being killed, which is dreadful. But it is rather bringing home to the Russian population, because it's also affecting. You know, imagine if somebody came in next week and blew up our Amazon warehouses, the public would suddenly fairly quickly realise that something was going on, wouldn't they? And in conjunction with what they've done with the oil, because they've been very successful in attacking oil refineries as well, they reckon that roughly 40% of Russia's total oil refining capacity has been cut away at the moment, which is astonishing, really. There are queues now in the far east of Russia, 6 hours for petrol. And like I say, in Crimea, they've got an emergency on their hands down there. The backdrop is that Ukraine would appear to be making progress. And against that, Rubio has met with Lavrov in Manila. And supposedly the only readout from that is that Washington wants to see a peace deal reached, which is quite interesting. I think Lavrov and I think Putin have lost faith in what they thought Trump was going to be able to achieve in terms of, I think most people thought they were going to be able to bully Zelensky into agreeing a deal, didn't they?
In simple terms, it'd be giving up at least the Donbass area, wouldn't it? Concessions about effectively demilitarization.
Yeah.
And total capitulation, all of which is not in their constitution anyway.
No.
So I don't think the Ukrainian people were ever going to do that while they still had a fight on, and they've definitely got a fight on, haven't they? And I think it's remarkable how they've created this industry in drones.
Yeah.
And the skills to use them. And you know, going full circle, this is one of the reasons that Elkan's resigned, wasn't it? That he felt that our defense department and industry was preparing for a war of the past.
Yeah.
And ironic to think it wasn't that long ago that the Ukrainians were coming over here to be trained by us.
Yes.
On the anti-tank weapons. Now it's probably the other way around, isn't it?
I would think so. Yeah. It's interesting in terms of the drone technology. It would appear that the Russians have now, you know, the Iranian drones they've got, the Shahids. They've turned those into jet drones now, so they can travel much faster than they were before, and that's proving a problem because the Ukrainians haven't got enough of these Patriot missiles to bring these. They've got their own homegrown anti-missile missiles, but so far they've only been produced to travel at 300 kilometers an hour, whereas these new Russian Shahids, they can travel at 500 kilometers an hour, which is a bit of a problem. They're upgrading their existing anti-missile missiles, so hopefully they'll be able to get hold of this. But the other thing that I found quite interesting, there's a company called Firepoint in Ukraine. Have you heard of them? Firepoint are the people who are developing Ukraine's own homegrown ballistic missiles, and they've got a missile that's operational now of up to 855 kilometers, which is 531 miles.
Right.
Which is capable of hitting Moscow. It would appear that they haven't used these missiles yet, but that must be putting quite some strain on Putin's inner circle as to what they think they're going to do next. Because there's some talk about them being able to produce quite a few hundred of these quite quickly. So, if they start firing ballistic missiles into Russia, that's a lot different to drones, isn't it, at the end of the day? So things are moving at great pace. I think we're heading towards a precipice where Putin either has to escalate quite considerably, or he needs to come to some sort of pragmatic agreement in terms of freezing the front lines. All the experts that I've been reading over the last few days are suggesting that he's making one final push to try and get as much of the Donbass as he can before he sues for peace. And that may be what's going on with regard to Lavrov and I've forgotten his name, Rubio, yeah. Little Marco, Manila. But no doubt we'll see as things progress. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the other component we've mentioned, you sort of touched on it, is the economic effect of the war on Russia. And inflation, interest rates, and their public services. Unless you're in the army or maybe an arms producer, you're probably really feeling the pinch at the moment. Whilst obviously their news flow is heavily, heavily restricted, ordinary people are probably wondering why on earth they're in this war. If truth be told, we never hear it, but if truth be told. So I think if you layer that on top of the real impacts on the battlefield and the potential, particularly for Russia, of more impact domestically as Ukraine's competence with drones and ballistic missiles now increases, the motivation for Putin to reach a deal seems to be higher. And I guess he's not motivated at all to try the, what do they call it, the tactical nuclear weapon bit. Because if he was, I think he would have done it by now.
Absolutely. I guess we just need to keep a beady eye on what happens over the next few months.
It would be nice to think that there would be some sort of resolution, because it's already gone on longer, hasn't it, than Russia's involvement in the Second World War.
Yeah,
and I think they've lost more troops, either dead or injured, than the Second World War. So it's certainly, in recent history, it's a blight for them.